And he actually came primarily for money. It's been pointed out several times that any time that the president wanted to solve a problem between Yarborough and Johnson, both of them were just a mile or so away from him, in Washington, so he could call them together at any time. But that was sort of a story that they told. I'm talking about staff put that out, that was why they were coming to Texas. But ever since he was elected, the president had this image of rich Texans, and he told Vice President Johnson that they wanted to come to Texas and get some of that Texan money, and that was really the truth of the matter. Now, that doesn't mean that we didn't make that an important part of the trip. Of course we wanted to raise money, but he didn't want to. Governor Connolly told him, you don't want to come to Texas and just rape the state, for money. And he had the concept he came up with that he wanted people just to see him in a non-political light. And that, of course, is what we ended up doing, because we did introduce him to people. It was a different situation entirely.
We had 4 nonpartisan events, starting out in San Antonio. San Antonio is where they arrived from Washington, in Air Force One. Great welcome in San Antonio. A nonpartisan event where there was a new facility at the Brooke Air Force Base dedicated. So that was from there they went to Houston for a fundraiser for head of the finance committee. They stayed there for several hours. Jackie spoke to a group of Latin Americans, Mexican Americans, and she spoke in Spanish, and they just went nuts. And that was a great event. They left there then and flew to Fort Worth. Fort Worth was the city where they're going to spend the night. The Texas Hotel in downtown Fort Worth, any of you who know that territory over there. They landed at Carswell Air Force Base, and a crowd met them at the Air Force Base. Although it was 11 o'clock at night, they had people along the roads. Now, let me pause a second in this trail and point out to you that why this was surprising. As I said, a lot of people didn't like Kennedy, and there was a lot of trepidation about him coming down here. In fact, Neiman Marcus founder, Stanley Marcus, wrote a personal letter to the president warning him he thought it'd be better if he didn't come. But he didn't pay any attention to that. Anyway, so we get into Fort Worth that night, and that's where they had the overnight stay that evening. In Fort Worth, they picked out, first of all, a suite for them. It's the nicest suite in the Hotel Texas. But the Secret Service vetoed it because it had more than one entrance. And, of course, they were worried about access, worried about what might get out of the president. So they ruled that out. They gave that suite to Lincoln. No, he's another day. To Johnson. They put him in the Johnson, put in that suite. So they picked another suite, which was very drab suite. And the art people of Fort Worth and Dallas were just horrified. The idea that the president and first lady would be staying in this dull, awful suite. So they went to work and put together an incredible display of fine art, rare pieces from all over the community, beautiful, beautiful art, and redecorated that suite. And this will come into play later. That's why I'm telling you about it up front. Anyway, the president and first lady woke up the next morning and saw this, and they were so impressed they called the woman who was head of that organized effort and thanked her very much for doing it. Okay, that morning then, you get up that morning, and there are 5,000 people waiting in a misty rain outside to see the president and first lady. Outside in a misting rain. Now, the background of that is that the only event scheduled originally was a Chamber of Commerce breakfast at the Hotel Texas. But that was a chamber event, and the tickets, of course, went to mostly the business community. So all of the people who had worked for Kennedy all those years couldn't get in. So they made so much noise that Jim Wright, who was then a congressman, worked on the plan to set up something else. And they set up this whole parking lot. And the president came out in this misty rain, and the place went nuts. They went crazy. So that was a high point, getting ready to go to Dallas. So everything was wonderful and happy at that point. Then they were getting ready to leave to go to Dallas. Then, of course, everybody got to being worried, as I told you, for all the reasons I've just outlined to you. I originally was not planning to go to Dallas.
I've actually had some work to do on some comments for the governor to use that night or the next day. But we worked so closely together that I knew I could do it. You know, it didn't take me all day to do it. But what happened is I came out, of course, the breakfast and the meeting with all the people out on the parking lot beforehand, the enthusiasm was just boiling. You know, it was kept people was so on such a high. And when we came out of the Hotel Texas to go, just at that moment, the sky kind of opened up. It had been very rainy that morning. And all of a sudden, you had these puffy white clouds and all this excitement. And I thought, I just can't miss the rest of this. I just cannot miss the rest of this. And it was a spot decision. And I jumped on the press bus and we walked to Dallas. That's exactly right. And obviously, the irony of that whole story is I never wrote the notes. Never had any reason to.
We flew to Dallas in 14 minutes. It was kind of ridiculous to raise a big jet to go 14 minutes, but it was for drama, you can understand, to get pictures like you saw a while ago. So we get to Love Field. And, of course, that was, I said, with some trepidation. We get to Love Field, we land over there, and the airport is mobbed with people. Very startling. So all the reporters who expected some problem, they couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe that he was getting received like that. You saw some of it a while ago. They had the President, First Lady left their Secret Service people, and as you see, worked the rope line. They went up and down the fence, holding their hands out to people. So they all then got on the limousine to head downtown. We left there, headed down Lemon Avenue to downtown Dallas. As we went along the road, there are always crowds on either side. They'd grow as we went on down the town. We got to downtown, to Main Street, turned on Main Street, came down Main Street. The crowds got bigger and bigger. People hanging out of office buildings on both sides. Confetti. You find, in my book, you'll find a picture of confetti falling down on the open car. So we were coming down that street, got to the base of Main Street, just about to the base of Main Street. All the press was laughing, oh boy, wow, they were so wrong, worried about this, it's going to be so great. You know, everybody was just in a jolly, jolly move. We turned the corner to head toward the sixth floor museum building. Wasn't a museum then, of course, the old book depository. We got about halfway down that block. I could see the limousine from my position in the bus because we were behind them about 7, and I hadn't made the turn. There's an incline down the street after you make the turn. So we're heading right in the middle of that block. Miss Connolly had just turned to the president and said, Mr. President, you certainly cannot say that Dallas doesn't love you. And about that time, pop, pop, pop. We didn't know what had happened. Remember, there were no cell phones. I thought at first perhaps it was backfire of motorcycles because we had them 2 or 3 deep on either side. And then very quickly I saw parents throwing their children down on the grass, covering them up. At about the same time, the limousine slowed for a moment, almost stopped, and then lurched away, heading toward the triple underpass. Well, we didn't know what happened, but it was not good. We knew that.
Miss Connolly, of course, heard the shots. She didn't know what it was either, but she saw him slump, and she pulled him down. As she described it, she wasn't doing anything that she didn't know that it was causing any harm or good. She just had the instinct that she said, I just didn't want anybody to hurt him anymore. Those were her words. So as she pulled him down, she happened to put pressure to close a gaping wound in his chest. And the doctors say later that saved his life, because as the doctors describe it, there was a big sucking wound. Sucking meaning there was a hole in his chest that had it not been closed, or at least semi-closed, that he would have died on the way to the hospital. We told the bus we'd go on to Trade Mart, where there are 2,000-3,000 people waiting in there for the president to arrive. And we all jumped off the bus. Newsmen raced to the telephones. I ran up to the podium where he wasn't mayor yet. Eric Johnson was the dinner chair, and he was on the podium up above me. And I went into him, I said, Mr. Johnson, we think there's been a terrible tragedy. We don't know for sure, but we think the governor and Ms. Connolly and the president and First Lady maybe have been hit. And he just stared down at me for a long time. And then I left, and I wanted to get to the hospital. And so I went on outside and ran into this friend of mine from Fort Worth who happened to be arriving to come to luncheon. And she took me quickly over to Parkland Hospital.
I didn't go around to the emergency room. I just saw this door at the end of the building, and I ran over there, walked into that door, nobody in sight, no security, nobody. I walked in there and quickly found a nurse, and I told her that I wanted to find Miss Connolly, that I just had to see Miss Connolly. So she took me down one floor, down to a pretty dark hallway. And there was a sight I will never forget. Standing on one side of that hall was Mrs. Kennedy, all alone and silent. Opposite her, she was just outside of trauma room 1. That's where the president was. Just across from her was Nellie Connolly, who, like her, was silent, neither woman speaking. I'll never, never forget that picture. All alone in their thoughts, wondering, praying whether their husband was going to live. Well, I felt out of place, very much out of place. But I had to get with Mrs. Connolly to find out what had happened, because we knew all these press guys would be there soon, and we had to have something to tell them what had happened. So calm as she could be, Ms. Connolly told me the seating arrangements, where they were seated, what was happening. She explained that to me. And so I wrote down on a little piece of paper, and I told her then that I needed to excuse myself, that Malcolm Kilduff was the press officer you've already heard about, and I had to go find him. We were going to set up a little press office downstairs to work out of, and I wanted to be armed that I could give some information. So sure enough, we got down there, got everything together. It was another 25 or 30 minutes, and of course everybody was very tense, as you can imagine at this point, and we felt the worst was going to come. And about 1 o'clock, Malcolm Kilduff took the microphone and gave the world the news that the president was dead. Immediately following what he told the press, I stood up right behind him.
I'm Julian Reed, R-E-A-D, aide to Governor Connolly.
Could you describe the seating position in the automobile?
Yes. The president was seated in the right rear seat. Opposite in the left rear was Mrs. Kennedy. Immediately ahead of the president on a jump seat was Governor Connally. Immediately opposite him was Mrs. Connally. Farther up, of course, we had Secret Service, as you know. As Mrs. Connally recalls, just before they reached the triple underpass, the shot rang out, the first shot, and she feels quite sure that it did hit the president. Governor Connally, who was seated here, turned immediately to see what happened. And as he turned, he was struck. The president, according to Mrs. Connally, immediately slumped, and Mrs. Kennedy grabbed him. A moment later, Governor Connally slumped, and Mrs. Connally grabbed him. Both women grabbed the men almost simultaneously and ducked as much as possible to guard against any possible gunfire following that. Mrs. Connally says that the next thing she recalls is a Secret Service man picking up a telephone in the car and giving instructions of, let's proceed direct to the nearest hospital.
And that was the beginning of my nightmare. I did not leave Parkland Hospital for 3 days. Immediately following this press conference, we started to be besieged by people from outside Dallas, of course, as you can imagine. Everybody wanted to know what happened, what else happened, what happens. So we were working through the night. Actually, about midnight, all of a sudden, we started to see a new wave of reporters, and they had foreign accents. And what that represented was newsmen from Europe who came as fast as they could fly here to get here, because Kennedy was so popular in Europe, more so even than in the United States anywhere. So that we dealt with that. Of course, everybody else wanted to know what about Governor Connally. So I had to talk to Ms. Connally from hour to hour. Is the president, is Governor Connally going to live? Is Governor Connally going to live? When I had talked to her, he was already in surgery back when I first saw her. So that was going on everywhere you look, there's, of course, drama in people's eyes. Everybody was in shock, you can imagine. About that time, they were trying to figure out what to do with the vice president, because he was one of the things that's very touching is that after we found out that she was going back, he would not. Johnson, Secret Service came up to him and said, "Mr. President, Mr. President." He would not go back to Washington until they could take Jackie's body. Jackie with the body with Jackie. That was a very, very, very tense time, as you can imagine. They got Sarah Hughes, a judge from here in Dallas, gave that the oath. I'm sure you all have seen that classic picture of all of them in the plane itself. There's a very interesting sidelight to that part of the trip, because the LBJ Library in Austin has a recording that Mrs. Johnson made. She had this habit of recording things all day. She did a kind of a recording diary. And as part of that period, she wrote a beautiful, beautiful rendition of how kind Mrs. Kennedy was to her and the vice president on the way back to Washington with her husband's body in the same plane. She couldn't believe how kind Miss Kennedy was to them. Well, okay, so back to what happened after that at the hospital. About 2 days later, this was on Friday, we set up a temporary office for Governor Connally so his office could function even though he was in the hospital. We were besieged by Connally friends. I had hundreds of messages from people wanting to know, how's John and Nellie? You know, they just had thousands of friends across Texas who were worried about them. That was no disrespect to the president, but after all, they were worried about their situation. We handled it as best we could, but there was all that tension, of course, all that time. Okay, so the press moves on. Most of them get out of there. They leave part of the rest of them have gone wherever. And by Sunday, I guess, yes, Sunday morning, we had been hearing from the press that they couldn't have a complete story until they heard from Miss Connolly, since she was the witness that, they heard about from me. So on Sunday morning, I worked with George Christian, who was another aide and worked in the press with me. We worked together on projects, and so we had put together some notes for her to speak. So we finally decided, okay, she's strong enough to do this. So on Sunday morning, she spoke to the press.
Words cannot fully express to Mrs. Kennedy and to the President's family our feelings, which we know all Texans share. Our son John will be our personal representative at the funeral of the President in Washington Monday. The Governor joins me in asking that all Texans observe the day of mourning Monday in memory of the President. Speaking again for the Governor and myself, I want to express our deepest appreciation for the wonderful friendship of so many fine people. We have received many telegrams, phone calls, and personal visits, for which we are very grateful. I especially appreciate the friendship and warmth of the people of Dallas, both before and after the terrible tragedy. We would also like to thank those who have sent so many beautiful flowers to the hospital. It is our hope that our friends who might wish to do this would instead contribute to the fund for the family of Officer Tippett. Our grief is all the greater because of his sacrifice. The Governor is now apparently out of danger. I talked to him just now, and he asked me to tell everyone he's going to be all right. He's in good spirits, and we deeply appreciate the care he has received at Parkland Hospital from the doctors, the nurses, and the staff. I have one other thing to say, if I can. We had been with the President and Mrs. Kennedy through the tour. It had been such a wonderful tour. And when we arrived in Dallas and the long motorcade, the people couldn't have been friendlier. The crowds couldn't have been more wonderful, more generous in their reaction to the President. And I just had such a good feeling about the way they had received him in this city. I had just turned around and said to him, "You can't say Dallas doesn't love you, Mr. President." That was it.
That was Sunday morning. We went back to the room, governor's room, to watch all the proceedings on television, all of the funeral activities in Washington, on a black and white set, of course, all there was those days. So we were watching it maybe for half an hour, and all of a sudden, we heard a big noise outside in the same area. And here comes Lee Harvey Oswald on a stretcher. Actually, we saw it live on TV, the shots, which I'm sure many of you have seen the film. And actually, body went wheeling by us 20 minutes later after we saw it live on television. And he was already turning green when he went down by us. So what else could go wrong? What else could happen? You know, all of this in this short period of time, shock after shock after shock. Well, of course, you know that everything went off in Washington okay. LBJ did take over the reins. There were no international coup and offering, but nonetheless, the shock was enormous. It was just the beginning of the pain for Dallas. Although it was a global story, Dallas was just about ready to go through a nightmare. I told you about the concern of him coming there in the first place, but there had been a couple of incidences in Dallas too, and only less than a month before, Adlai Stevenson, who was representative to the United Nations, he was in not a rally, but a meeting in downtown Dallas, and was hit with somebody hit him with a raincoat. I mean, a parasol, just beat on him. So there are things like that that had been publicized. Everybody knew it happened. So we had those concerns from what had occurred. At any rate, Dallas ran into it immediately. The head of a large Dallas foundation in Washington, in New York, in New York, was thrown out of a taxi cab when the driver learned that he was from Dallas. People from Dallas were actually refused service in some restaurants outside of Dallas. This was the beginning of a dark, dark period for Dallas. And Dallas really didn't want to confront it. It was years before there was anything done in the way of a memorial. Finally, there was a square box erected about 3 blocks from what's now the 6th floor museum, which nobody liked it. It's a very sterile concrete box, white. Nothing happened. Then what occurred kind of remarkably, all this time the school book depository was sitting there. Shortly after, really, the assassination, it was no longer used as a school book storage room. And then it declined even further. It was called, 2 fires were caught over a number of years. And the big tenant moved out, so it was just sort of sitting there. So about that time, Dallas County needed more office space. And the gentleman who was in charge of looking for more space had an office just across the street from that building. Meantime, at that building, down on the street, right at the corner there under that window, there was always a crowd, any time of the day or night, Saturday or Sunday, anywhere. People would mill around down there on the plaza, and they invariably, you watch them, you invariably would crane their necks and look up that 6th floor museum. So this gentleman had an idea. Up to that point, nobody had made a serious effort to do anything in the way of a memorial. So he thought, if we could buy that building for the county for extra space, we could leave that floor up there for some sort of event, not event, but something, a memorial. And so they bought the building. And before he started work on it, he contacted a lady who was head of the society of the Historical Society in Dallas. And she was Republican. And he called her up and told her about this idea, and he said, I think we could turn that 6th floor into a museum. She said, you want to do what? I mean, it was a thought she couldn't even digest. But she said she had a responsibility to at least listen to it. So he asked her to meet him down the building. Now remember, the building's empty. Dust, dirt everywhere. That 6th floor exactly like it was at 1963. And she said, we went up the back elevator, freight elevator. Creaky elevator. Get out of the elevator and start walking toward that dark corner. Floor is creaking, cobwebs everywhere. And she said, I got that corner, and it hit me. Said it was very eerie, but I knew we had to do something. That was the beginning of a long trail. It took more than a decade to get the 6th floor museum to become a reality. So obviously now, it's the centerpiece for any of the history. Magnificent. If you haven't seen it the last few years, you've got to see it. It's much better than it was, as I say, just a few years ago. So anyway, fast forward. First of all, well, let me tell you. First of all, I want to tell you what did not happen on this trip. I told you a lot of what did happen, but a lot of things didn't happen that people do not know. It's all in the book. Remember, there was to be a big dinner in Austin that night. That was a big gala. People had come in from all over the state. In fact, more than half of them had already checked in their hotels. Remember the time of the day. So here we had 5,000 people in town to celebrate and meet the president. There was a reception scheduled for the governor's mansion for all the members of the Texas House and Texas Senate, all set up to do that afternoon before the dinner that night. Walter Jeton, the barbecue king at that time, was already firing up the coals for a big, big dinner that night. So here this happens. So at 1 o'clock or 1:30, all of a sudden, all this happened. All these people in Austin for something that was not going to take place. So what to do? What to do? A young state representative named Ben Barnes came up with the idea, went to the speaker, and proposed they have a prayer meeting that afternoon or that evening. And that's what they did. They actually had it in the House chamber at the Capitol. They had a very brief, dignified service, and that was how they marked the tragedy that night. The rest of the story is that the next day, that night, the president and first lady were going to spend the night at the LBJ Ranch. That was the climax of the entire trip. That was a big deal, going to be a big deal. They prepared the house and the grounds, of course, that you'd think they would for the president, vice president coming all the way to their home. It'd be a good opportunity for the vice president to have one-on-one time with Kennedy. It was something they were looking forward to. They were preparing out at the ranch. They were anticipating what they could do to please the president or first lady. They heard that he liked corn soup, so they prepared some corn soup. They heard that she liked she liked her drinks on the rocks, champagne on the rocks. So they were ready to prepare that, and there were a lot of pies all over the top of the counters. And Ms. Johnson and Mr. Johnson, Vice President, told their house staff, don't let us come in through the kitchen. The way the house is laid out up there, behind the house, there's an airstrip, and that became the entrance. Everybody'd come in through the back door, by the beer cooler and the washing machine. It wasn't exactly a royal welcome. And he said, by all measure, don't let us come in through the kitchen. And he said, make us go around and come in the living room from the front. Well, they never had to worry about that. Another thing that was part of that scene that night, there's going to be this huge barbecue the next day, but the scene that night, the butler was preparing the beds for them. And for the president's bed, he was awaiting, he did all he could. He was awaiting a board that traveled with the president. The president had a bad back. He'd had it for years and years and years, very painful. So there was actually a bed embedded in a mattress that he carried with him wherever he went. The butler couldn't do anything about that except leave space for it. Needless to say, it never came. So that's another thing that did not happen that people don't know about. Fast forward again to 3 years ago. 3 years ago, we had the 50th anniversary. And, of course, it was a big deal, as you all know, the whole world. Well, to prepare for that, what are you going to do in Dallas for that? obviously the Dallas has recognized it through the decades and has a museum. But what do you do to mark this? Well, Mike Rollins, your current mayor, wanted to be sure that the occasion was not overtaken by some more people with their theories, the conspiracy gangs. So he very wisely appointed a blue ribbon committee of Dallas leadership to plan an event, to plan the anniversary. And it's a very dignified thing. He had a speaker, his name, famous speaker, you'll know him, historian, do a very beautiful talk. They had the naval choir. He was a Navy man, of course, a naval choir, and it was all within a fence around the plaza, around Dealey Plaza. The only bad thing that happened is it was cold November, the coldest November day in years and years. But it went off without a hitch. He was proactive in doing this, and all the press was good. But that wasn't all the story. I talked to you a little bit about the artwork in Fort Worth. Well, there was a young guy who worked for the Louvre in Paris who came to Dallas and became part of the staff of the Museum of Art in Dallas. He met a friend. He was visiting his house one night, and his friend told him, "See that picture on the wall? That was in the hotel last night when the president and first lady slept in Fort Worth." Well, this young man just went nuts. He says, "Oh my God, we have to reassemble that exhibit for the 50th anniversary." So they went on a search to find all these pieces of art, 14, 16 pieces, I can't remember. And they found all but 3 of them, if you can believe that, owners scattered all over the world. They decided to have a special exhibit made to honor that, and they did so. They published a beautiful tabletop book, heavy, gorgeously done thing with all that art. They put that art collection on display for the public, the Dallas Museum of Art, from about August to about a week or 2 before the assassination. The Museum of Art. Then it moved to Fort Worth to the Amon Carter Museum from that time until the middle of January. Well, there was another piece of the tribute to JFK. In the meantime, Fort Worth, on their own, with no real coordination, they decided, city manager people and fathers of the city decided that they would do a memorial in that parking lot I told you about across the street. So they constructed a magnificent tribute to JFK. You can see it all night long. It's right across the street from what's now the Hilton. It's lovely, just absolutely wonderful. That's another piece of what I call a mosaic that just kind of happened at the same time without any master plan. San Antonio, another touch, San Antonio. When they landed in San Antonio, I told you about the speech the president made at Brooke Air Force Base. There was for that event, and that event only, craftsmen put together this magnificent podium, like this one, only larger and finer, just for that one event, that one speech, that one occasion. Well, after it was over, they stored it away, put it somewhere, and years passed, and they couldn't find it. They didn't know where it was, because when this started coming up, someone remembered that, said, why don't we do something with that? They finally found it in storage, and they cleaned it up, and it became a major attraction at the Whitty Museum in San Antonio. So that's another piece of the picture that came together. The final thing that plays into that is that the LBJ Library in Austin was renovated, and they put more and more material there relating to the assassination, including that Lady Bird story, that wonderful story of hers, thanking Ms. Kennedy for her kindness. So that mosaic that developed out of that. Certainly never did anything to take away the pain. But I think from my perspective, and the perspective I think of most anybody who was turned off and hurt so badly by it, I think it's reconciliation, that regardless whether you liked Kennedy or didn't, it gives reconciliation to one of the saddest hours in our history, so that at least we can have some peace about it. Thank you very much.
Hi. Go back to the hospital and Trauma Room 1. When you saw Jackie Kennedy standing outside there and Mrs. Connolly, you must have gotten some kind of a view into Trauma Room 1 so you knew, or you could see who was in the room, what was going on a little bit, that kind of thing. If you could maybe talk about that.
The truth of the matter, sir, is that I was blocked out. I couldn't tell you. The surgeons were, of course, in the room, and he was so far gone already, that I didn't really pay any attention. I was not there long. My principal, I thought, was to get to Nellie and see if she was okay, see if the governor was okay, and then I left. So I do not have any remembrance of anybody else around.
I was just wondering if you could go into how the governor or Mrs. Connolly was informed of the death of the president. When was he informed, or what he said after he found out that President Kennedy had been killed?
He wasn't told about it. You got to remember, he was in surgery for 6 hours, so he did not. I think it was probably 2 days at least, and he asked Nellie, "What about the president?" And she told him. He said, "I thought it would be. I thought that what would happen." He felt like he was dead.
Lady Bird asked the First Lady what she would like to have at the ranch when they came there. And Jackie said that she would like to have terry cloth washcloths, something lightweight, and that was something very special to her. Well, of course, Lady Bird had those there. So there were terry cloth washcloths at the ranch for Jackie, and they were never used, which I think is rather interesting.
You had mentioned that LBJ would not leave until the body of the dead president was on the plane with him. Was that something that LBJ wanted or Jackie wanted?
He would not do the swearing in until Jackie joined them. She was back at front of the plane, I guess, to be front of the plane. And somebody from the staff, I think, first said, "No, she's not going to be in that picture." And someone else, we just went to her and just asked her quietly, and she decided she would be in the picture. And of course she is. And that, I might add that was surprising to some of the Kennedy people. If you could imagine, I've thought about that a lot since I was so close to Governor Connolly. I can just imagine the bitterness of all that staff to have this happen in front of their eyes. I can imagine how it must have been hard to even face Johnson.
Hello, thank you for being here. I have a question to ask. You've made mention from the time the shot happened and then just into the hospital, and you were talking about being the bus. Were you able to drive through the area going down through the triple overpass into, like kind of parting the waters between the people that were on the lawn and the people that were near Daly Plaza. And if you were able to remember or recall, what was that scene like? You know, people still filming. I know you had said that people had hit the deck and were lying on the ground. Just an overall view. I'm a history teacher, so I'd like to kind of get an idea if you were able to go through that area and recall what you had seen shortly after the motorcade sped away, or excuse me, not the motorcade, but the limousine sped away.
Oh yes, we went through. We actually followed Stemmons Freeway, same way they did. You know, if you just go up Stemmons, you go through the triple underpass, and go. That's really the most direct way to go. So
It was the only way to go.
Yeah, really.
I wanted him to describe what the scene was like as he was driving through that. I mean, I know he said that people were lying on the ground.
Well, I'll tell you a little tidbit that answers that a little bit. Nellie Connolly herself made the comment. I can't remember whether it's maybe in her book. Talks about as she pulled the governor down. You know, I think you all have heard the story about everyone associated with the case. She pulled the governor down when he was shot and closed a wound. There was a gaping wound in his chest. He was blown open. And she pulled him down, folded him down beside her, and closed that wound so it wasn't sucking sound. And doctors say that saved his life. So she pulled him down, and it kind of closed, that area. But to tie to that, about what she saw, she said she could just imagine her thought of passing. This is when on the way from the triple underpass to the hospital after he'd been shot. She said, I just wondered how horrible it must be, all these people on both sides of the street watching us and wondering what in the world is going on.
If I understood you correctly, you said that first you heard the 3 shots, and then shortly after that, the limousine came to a stop, or nearly to a stop. I've read quite a few books on the assassination, and I don't know that all of them indicate this, but some of the authors maintain that the limousine came nearly to a stop before that shot occurred that took the president's head off.
I don't know that I can definitively answer that. I was, of course, back from 5 or 6 cars. I just do remember vividly seeing the 2 sites that I told you about. I can't tell you for sure on the timing. I just remember very much that it did slow down and then just lurched forward.
Mrs. Connolly had lost her manuscript for 35 or 40 years. Mrs. Connolly had lost her notes or put them away. Tell them that story. That's a good story.
Well, after they went back to the mansion, they were there for about 10 days. After they went back to the mansion, Mrs. Connolly took out a legal pad, and for her children and grandchildren, she told me, she wanted to tell the story of what she'd experienced. So she in longhand, that pad, everything she could remember that she had gone through, to write it down. And it turned out to be about 7 or 8 legal-sized pages, as I recall. She took them and put them into a file, a metal file, in the mansion, and forgot about them. Never came back to look at them until she was cleaning out one day and ran across them in this drawer. And as she told me, she said, I pulled them out and read them. I thought, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. That's pretty accurate. So she thought, well, maybe I ought to tell. Well, no. The way it started is that some friend
ask her to talk about it, some event. And she did. She talked about it, just told her story. And then another friend heard about it, so she ended up getting all these requests to talk about her notes. And so then she got the idea, or it had been suggested to her, that she ought to write a book. Well, so first time we tried this, we had a draft of a book, went to New York. We had set up about 5 or 6 agents, and she was very well received. Of course, she's so charming, nobody would not see her. And she told this story, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 trips we made to top. Everybody loved her. Everybody welcomed her. No offers for the book. Nobody. So, we put it away and forgot it. They said, this was just about the time that the publishing business had been hurt, was kind of in great decline. And so they weren't buying anything. It's not aces, straights, or flushes. They just weren't gambling on anything. So we forgot it for another 2 or 3 years. And then the guy that used to do our shows on CNN at 8 or 9 at night.
Larry King?
Huh?
Larry King?
Larry King Live. Larry invited her to do a show. And I took her up there. She did do the show for the full hour. He couldn't get enough of her for a full hour. And after that, we got a contact from an agent in New York over the transom, and he saw the merit in it. He wanted to get a publisher for it. So long story short, he did. A very enthusiastic young guy. She wrote the book that y'all, one or 2 or 3 of you have mentioned. You have it. She wrote the book, and we went all over. I went with her on that book tour. It was a very gratifying experience to watch her, in effect, be rejected the first time, but to have this come back. And it was a glorious occasion. Of course, everywhere in Texas, there's mobs turned out for her. In New York City, we had Walter Cronkite, Liz Smith, at least half a dozen to 8 big headliners like that came to the gala reception. So she had a wonderful experience in that. And I'm glad you asked about the book, because it's something that I was very proud that she could do it.
One of my questions is, how did you land the job working for Governor Conley in the first place? Where were you at as a student, as a writer before you landed the gig with Governor?
When Governor Conley announced for governor in 1962, I had done a number of political campaigns in Fort Worth, Dallas, around, and I had handled. Y'all are so young you won't even remember this name. But Jim Wright, who became House Speaker, United States, I handled his campaign when he overcame an impossible task. And so I had some reputation. And when Governor Conley decided to run for governor, I just got a call. I said, Governor Conley would like to meet you for coffee at the hotel, the Texas Hotel, right 2 days after Christmas. And I said, sure, I'll meet him. And he told me, Governor Conley, remember now, well, I hope you remember, that he served as Secretary of the Navy for the governor, for Kennedy. And he resigned that position to run for governor. And he told me, he said, I have watched while I was in this job in Washington, where all of the grants are going for research and higher education. And he said, Texas must change. We are an agrarian society primarily, early oil. He said, we have to have education if we're going to compete. And that was a story he outlined to me when I had coffee with him. He said, we have to change this state. And that became his flag. And, of course, after he was elected governor, he and Ben Barnes did more for higher education than any governor before or since. But to finish your answer, I signed on with him. I said, sure. He said, I don't know for sure what all I need, but I think you do. And I signed on with him, handled his first campaign, handled his second campaign, his third campaign. When he ran for president unsuccessfully in 1980, I was his director of communication. Of course, that was a sad one for us. We lost big time. But I worked with him and actually worked with a friend to do his funeral and Ms. Conley's funeral. Interesting aside, both same service, same church. When he announced for governor, there were 5 other candidates jumped in the race. He was running against a sitting governor, Price Daniel, who was on the 4th term. He was running against him. He was running against the sitting attorney general. He was running against a young liberal named Don Yarborough, no kin to Senator Yarborough. I forget, there was one more. Anyway, we had 4 opponents. The first poll that was run, polls aren't very reliable this week, are they? We had 4%. In fact, we made up little old 4% buttons, for supporters to wear. Anyway, we hit upon the idea. Connally was well known among political people who were active, but he'd never held office, and so he didn't have name ID at that point. And of course, most of these other, General Walker, if y'all remember who he is, he's one of the early nuts. Yeah. Anyway, we came up with this idea of putting together a little series of real short 5-minute programs for TV. So we came up with a name. We bought a strip of shows Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings at 7:25. That's the cutaway of the Today Show, has been for years. Nowadays, NBC, most stations, they cut away for the news at 7:25, and the local station does local news. But at that time, you could buy that 5 minutes. So we came up with this plan of buying 5 minutes Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and we produced a show called Coffee with Connolly. Coffee with Connolly. And each 5 minute, we would deal with a different subject. But first of all, we wanted people to get to know him and her. So the first series we did, we went out to his home, Fort Worth, taped it live, and then ran it Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And the first program we did, we had all 3 of the children come downstairs in their pajamas and introduce themselves to the world. And that turned out to be a remarkably effective tool because we had enough repetitive 3 times a week, people got to know him. And we'd talk about, one night we'd talk about environment, or another night we'd talk about what we need to do about education. We talked about education a lot. But anyway, Coffee with Connolly was credited, a lot of the credit for Connolly winning, getting known name-wise across the state. So Coffee with Connolly will always have a warm place in my heart.